The X Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Rob McConnell's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the X Zone Radio Show or endorsed in any manner by Rob McConnell, rel-mar McConnell Media Company, the X Zone Broadcast Network, its affiliated networks, stations, employees, or advertisers.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
And welcome to the X Zone one and all. My name is Rob McConnell, and for the next 4 hours, I am your host. I am your guide as together we cross the time-space continuum to this place that I call the X Zone. It's a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. It's a place where fact is fiction and fiction is truly reality. The X Zone comes to you Monday through Friday from 10 p.m. Eastern until 2 a.m. Eastern on the Talkstar Radio Network, Mutual Broadcast Network, iHeartRadio, and of course the X Zone Broadcast Network, as well as now on Simul Radio. And if you'd like to watch the TV show version of our broadcast on the X Zone TV channel, just go to www.simultv.com. That is the only place where you can watch the X Zone TV channel. 365 with paranormal programming from around the world. X Zone Nation, my guest this hour is Stephen Braude. He is Emeritus Professor and former Chair of Philosophy at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is a past president of the Parapsychological Association, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and the recipient of numerous grants and awards, including a fellowship from the National Endowment for Humanities, and the prestigious F.W.H. Myers Memorial Medal from the Society for Psychical Research. His earliest research was in logic and philosophies of language and time. After that, he shifted focus to the evidence for psychic phenomenon to see if it would provide new insights into traditional problems in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of the mind. Joining me now is Stephen Braude. And Stephen, welcome to the X Zone.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
It's my great pleasure, sir. I was wondering if you could tell us, what was it that intrigued you into investigating the paranormal? Or researching, I should say.
Well, it's an embarrassing story, actually. It all began back in graduate school when I considered myself to be a kind of hard-nosed materialist. Not for any particularly good reason. It was just a kind of intellectual conceit I was cultivating in those days. And it was a slow day in Northampton, Massachusetts, and a couple friends came over. We'd seen the only movie in town, and they said, let's play this game called Table Up. What they meant was, let's have a seance. Now, none of us knew anything about parapsychology, but my friends had played this so-called game a number of times, and they said when it worked, it was a lot of fun. So for the next 3 hours, to my astonishment and horror, actually, in my own house with my own table, I saw my table tilt up and down without any means of support as far as I could determine. We were standing next to the table. If one of my friends left to go to the other room, it would still rise under our fingers. It was rising in the wrong direction to be explained in terms of muscular movement. But I didn't know anything about parapsychology. I was busy writing a dissertation on temporal logic. I didn't want to screw up my budding philosophical career.
Right.
So I knew I couldn't really talk to my mentors about this, so I put it out of mind until I finished my PhD, got a job, and got tenure. And by that time, I had made something of a reputation for myself doing logic and the philosophy of language. And I realized at that point, given the joys of academic freedom that tenure was supposed to provide, that if I was an honest philosopher in intellect, I needed to really come to grips with this thing that had happened back in grad school. And I knew at that point that some important philosophers had taken parapsychology seriously. So I read what they had to say. I decided that indeed there was really something worth sinking my teeth into. And so I started investigating it for myself. And after a while, cranked out 6 books.
Wow. What kind of, or what sorts of cases have you focused on?
Well, I'm a psychokinesis junkie. I learned fairly early on that certain kinds of cases are not very easy to investigate if you don't have unlimited budget and time.
Right.
And it may not come as a surprise to you that the University of Maryland did not have provisions in its philosophy budget for paranormal case investigations. So that meant doing haunting investigations or poltergeist investigations was really not a smart use of my time. But if I could find people who claimed and really seemed to have the ability to make objects move on demand, then this would be not only dramatic evidence, but it was something worth investigating. And by the time I reached that understanding, I had already written a couple books in parapsychology, including one on macro PK, macro psychokinesis, really large-scale stuff, mostly from the heyday of the Spiritist movement in the mid to late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so that's the kind of stuff I've been chasing after. So I've investigated mediums of various kinds who can make tables apparently levitate and make objects move at a distance. I investigated a woman in Florida whose body would break out in a kind of golden-colored foil instantaneously and near at hand. And those are among the best cases I've investigated.
How did you how did you explain the gold leaf lady?
Well, I don't know how to explain it in terms of what's going on physically.
Right.
I mean, there are 2 leading scientific explanations or quasi-scientific explanations. One would be that it's a materialization. It's something that she's creating de novo, just out of nothing, seemingly. The other possibility is that it's what's known as an apport, where something is moved from one location and reappears somewhere else. So there are lots of similarities between apports and materializations, but the basic difference is that in materializations, things are created anew, and in apports, they're just moved. But what I believe I can explain is what was going on psychologically. I think I understand the psychogenesis of the phenomena. And what I'd say about that is that the woman in this case, her name is Katie. In many ways, she's a classic poltergeist victim. And what we know about poltergeist victims is that although they're usually teenagers or adolescents, they're not always so. And the received view about poltergeist victims or agents is that they have all these intense emotions and no convenient, conventional way of expressing them. And so they come out as kind of brute psychic flailings about, and things will shatter, fly around, and so on. Now, it's not just teenagers or adolescents who have deep emotional problems. Marriages are fertile grounds for those too, as I can personally attest. And Katie's psychic abilities, which are considerable and many, didn't emerge until her second marriage, which by all accounts has been a very difficult marriage. And so she started out having poltergeist-like phenomena occurring around her. Objects were rearranging themselves, appearing and disappearing. And one day a carving set appeared out of nowhere. And her husband said to her, well, what good is it if it isn't money? Wow. And then 2 days later, her body started to break out in this golden-colored foil. Now, what you need to know is that the foil was not really gold, it's brass. So symbolically, this satisfies Katie's husband's demand for producing something valuable, but she doesn't really have to bear the responsibility of being the goose that laid the golden egg, which I think would be a pretty weighty responsibility. And I also think it's a way of subtly expressing her rage against her husband, because she's not really giving him what he wanted. He wanted something valuable, and she's giving him fool's gold. You know, she's giving him the psychic finger.
How do you explain that? The manifestation of of brass, the movement of a table, the manifestation of a carving set of knives. How do we explain that in today's technological age?
Well, I think the temptation is always to look for an analytical explanation, that is, in terms of some underlying processes, more or less in the way in which we explain heat as molecular motion.
Right.
But I think there's a deep philosophical issue here, and the issue is this. Most scientists assume that explanation by analysis in terms of underlying processes can't go on indefinitely, that sooner or later you're going to reach a kind of ground level where you have primitive phenomena that you can't go behind and look for lower level phenomena that explain them. And I think that's right. That doesn't mean that all explanation comes to an end. It just means that analytical explanation comes to an end. Some phenomena presumably are fundamental. Now, that seems to me perfectly okay, but what scientists usually assume in addition is that wherever this lowest level of phenomena occur, it's always at the level of the very small, the atomic, subatomic, neurological, biochemical, but never at the observable level. But there's a massive philosophical literature to suggest that that's wrong. I call that assumption the small is beautiful assumption.
All right, stand by, Stephen. We've got to take our first break for this hour. X Zone Nation, our guest this hour is Stephen Braude. And the website is jazzphilosopher.com. That's www.jazzphilosopher.com. And Stephen and I will return after this commercial break as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast station, studios, and offices here in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone. Stephen Braude is our special guest of this hour, and his website is jazzphilosopher.com. Have you investigated anything that, or any event that many reported to be real, but turned out to be fraudulent?
Oh, yes. Excuse me. Yes. Obviously, it has me choked up. I investigated a medium in Germany. This is Las Vegas throat, so pardon me.
It's all right.
A medium in Germany named Kai Müge, who's a physical medium. He's what's known to many as a mixed medium. That is, some of his phenomena, I believe, are genuine and some are not. It's a phenomenon I think I understand. There can be many reasons, especially if you're making a living doing mediumistic things, that you might sometimes need to help the phenomena along. But I investigated Kai over several years, and I've observed some things that were pretty impressive. I mean, for example, objects were moving at a distance from him, way out of arm's reach, while I was draped all over him. That is, I was controlling both his arms and legs and almost lying on his lap. Nevertheless, things were moving at a distance. I've observed some pretty impressive table levitations where tables were not only levitating fully, but they'd be aloft for like 20 seconds and were swaying back and forth to the rhythm of music that was playing in the background. On the other hand, we know that Kai has cheated on some occasions, and some of his phenomena are very suspicious. I tested him in Austria over a series of seances, and we got some interesting phenomena, including a good table levitation, but we weren't able to fully convince ourselves that the ectoplasm that he was pulling out of his mouth hadn't been concealed somewhere else, even though I did a strip search of him. I mean, I don't know how deeply you want to get into this. I didn't do a full cavity search. And the reason that's relevant is, well, first of all, I didn't do a full cavity search because that really doesn't fall within my areas of expertise. And it matters because there was a Hungarian medium at one point, and I gather there have been others, who actually was hiding various sorts of things in his rectum and could retrieve them and then put them back later on.
That just didn't wreck him. It nearly killed him.
It didn't kill him, but he apparently was unusually versatile.
I would imagine. Why do people get conned? You know, not...
Well, people want to believe.
Is that what it is? Is it all because we want to believe there's more to this existence than we can see, feel, hear, and touch?
I think for many people that is surely the reason. And it's understandable. I mean, especially if the phenomena in question bear on the issue of survival of bodily death. Because I think in our heart of hearts, most of us want to believe that this physical life is not the end of all things, and that maybe after we die physically, we'll be able to reunite with our friends, or take vengeance on our enemies, or if maybe just get our hair back.
You know, hence the creation of heaven and hell.
Yes.
How do you think people communicate with those on the other side, those who have passed? Do you believe that is possible?
I'm certainly open to it. One of my books was on the evidence for survival of bodily death. And my own position is that it depends which day you ask me.
Okay, that's fair enough.
And the reason I say that is there are various alternate explanations that we have to consider, and some of which are extremely difficult to rule out. The one that's most difficult to rule out is the hypothesis that the phenomena are all produced by psychic functioning among the living that just simulates the evidence of survival. And it's very difficult to rule that out, because even if you believe that post-mortem survival occurs and there's evidence for it, you need to suppose that the very same kind and same degree of psychic functioning is going on between the dead and the living. So, for example, if a medium claims to be in touch with my deceased Uncle Harry, and Uncle Harry says to me through the medium that he's glad to know that I'm happy in my new job. Now, if I hadn't spoken about my new job, you need to consider, well, how does the deceased Uncle Harry know what I'm thinking? That has to be explained in terms of pretty good telepathy. And how does the medium know what Uncle Harry is saying? That also has to be explained in terms of telepathy. So, and in addition to that, if the medium provides verifiable information, I mean, if Uncle Harry says, there's a secret will that I hid in a secret compartment in my desk, and nobody alive knew about that by normal means, and we can verify that, then that very same information was available to us through clairvoyance. So it's virtually impossible to rule out the living agent psychic functioning explanation or alternative explanation for survival.
Years ago, I had a psychic, a medium, come on the show. And we came back from a commercial break, and she said, "Rob, I have a message for you from the other side." I said, "Could you share it?" "Certainly. On air with your audience listening?" I said, "I have nothing to hide from my audience." So she said, "All right. The message is from a young lady, your sister, who is on the other side. And she wants me to tell you that she's with you all the time." And she went on and painted a beautiful picture over the next 6.5 minutes. And then I had to break the bad news to her that I'd never had a sister. And at the time we were using a shotgun and a toilet flush to say goodbye to guests that we found anything but credulous. And another thing, we used to go to all the psychic fairs between Toronto. Oh my gosh, we went to Ottawa, we went to Kingston, we went all over Ontario, even down to Las Vegas, Florida, doing the show from these different psychic events. And after a while, you get to see the same psychics at the same fairs. And I would see the same people go from one psychic to the next, one psychic to the next, one psychic to the next, until they went to a psychic and they walked away out of the psychic fair. And I learned later on that this was because they got the answer that they wanted from the fifth psychic. How can anyone know who is legitimate when it comes to soothsayers or practitioners of any divination within the paranormal, and who's a con?
Well, for one thing, if they're not giving you any verifiable information, which nobody has normal access to, then you don't even know if they're genuinely psychic at all, whether or not their information is coming from the deceased. But the kind of message you got is really useless.
Right, but if you're one of those people, I'm a skeptic. You know, I'm a journalist. I'm an ex-police investigator. I want proof. I want evidence. If I cannot touch, see, feel, smell any of the actual physical evidence, to me, it goes into the category of But with today's technology, getting information is very easy. But what I have learned is that the power of belief is the strongest power in the universe. And there are those who want to believe so bad, Stephen, that they're willing to take anything that a psychic says and then try and fit what the psychic says into their life.
Yes. And there's not much you can do about that.
No.
I mean, you can't reason people out of positions they haven't been reasoned into, and there's only so much you can do about total credulity or stupidity.
Right. That's very true. Have you done any investigation on spiritual healings?
Some. I don't know a whole lot about that, but I used to know a very famous healer who lived in the Baltimore area named Olga Worrell. And I've seen Olga do some pretty remarkable healings, and I know there have been other accounts. It's very hard to know what's going on in those cases. It's not like you can actually trace the causal lines here with a meter of some sort. So you don't know whether you're dealing, again, with the power of belief and what really amounts to being a placebo effect, or whether it's something that is being done through the efficacy of the healer, and whether even the efficacy of prayer is a real thing.
All right,
These are very hard to know.
Stephen, stand by. You and I have to take our news break at the bottom of the hour. Exonation Stephen Braude is our special guest this hour. His website is jazzphilosopher.com. Now, the the X Chronicles newspaper is available for one and all with our compliments at www.xchroniclesnewspaper.com. We've been publishing it monthly since 1990. Right now, it's 92 full pages in color. You can read it online, and you can download it. You can even go on to Amazon.com and buy a printed copy. That's the X Chronicles newspaper, www.xchroniclesnewspaper.com. Exonation, Stephen Braude is our special guest. His website is jazzphilosopher.com. And besides writing over 100 published articles, Stephen has written 6 books: ESP and Psychokinesis, A Philosophical Examination, The Limits of Influence, Psychokinesis and the Philosophy of Science, First Person Plural, Multiple Personality and the Philosophy of the Mind, Immortal Remains, The Evidence for Life After Death, and The Gold Leaf Lady and Other Parapsychological Investigations. Once again, www.jazzphilosopher.com. And his latest book is Crimes of Reason. Tell us a little bit about Crimes of Reason, Stephen.
That's a collection of essays, some of which are brand new and some of which are updates and minor revisions of what I believe are some of my better articles. And it's the kind of book you get to write toward the end of your career, where you want to bring things together and show connections between various essays that otherwise might not be so apparent. But it deals with a lot of things. It deals with various philosophical problems about how we explain psychic phenomena or just any psychological phenomena, problems about paranormal research and why it's almost ludicrous to be doing laboratory research in parapsychology. That's one of the themes.
Why are there not more scientists and researchers like yourself investigating the paranormal?
Because it's a career kiss of death.
But
I mean, that's
why?
why I think it turned out to be a very lucky. I can't say it was a smart thing, but it was a lucky thing that I didn't get into this until I got tenure.
But don't scientists, philosophers, researchers want to discover the undiscovered? Don't they want to explain the workings of the unexplainable?
Well, look, I used to think so.
Okay.
I used to think that philosophers and scientists in particular were committed to discovering the truth, and that they'd even be happy to find out that they were mistaken, so long as finding that out brought them closer to the truth.
Right.
But now I realize that that's a ridiculously idealized picture of things. I've even discovered that most academic and other professions are deficient in the one virtue that's supposed to characterize the field. I mean, so scientists aren't objective, philosophers aren't wise, psychologists aren't perceptive, psychiatrists are crazy, lawyers don't care about justice, physicians aren't healers, artists lack taste, historians lack perspective, and so on.
Wow. You just ruined everybody's life. Thank you very much for that. We'll speak to you next year or whenever you're... No, but... You've got everybody now on the internet, which is the largest septic tank that man has ever created. It's full of misinformation. There's more crap in it than anything else. And you've got all these yahoos running around claiming to be ghost investigators, paranormal psychologists, or whatever. How do you, as a professional, deal with this?
I just try to keep my own nose clean.
Does it work?
I mean, people are going to resort to guilt by association, no matter what I do. So they can't really very easily impugn my actual work. They can only, I think, impugn what I've done by associating me unfairly with people who do unsatisfactory work or just sleazebags.
What's your take on ghosts and hauntings?
Well, I think there's some very intriguing evidence for ghosts and hauntings, though I don't consider it the strongest evidence for survival of bodily death, because very seldom do you get anything that's verifiable and that gives us information that we couldn't have found out normally. There's a different kind of contemporary sort of evidence that I think is actually more interesting, and that's the evidence from heart-lung transplants. Do you know about that?
No, share it with us.
In many cases, recipients of new hearts or lungs have taken on personality characteristics of the donor, whom they knew nothing about. And some of these cases are particularly intriguing. So, for example, a young man received, I think it was a heart transplant from a lesbian painter. And after the surgery, he suddenly developed an anomalous interest in art.
Mm-hmm.
He would spend hour after hour in art museums. He started carrying a purse. And his girlfriend reported that he started making love to her in a way that was completely different from the way they used to make love. And that seemed to suggest the knowledge of female anatomy that he had never displayed before.
Oh, for a minute there, I thought you were talking about Bruce Jenner. How do we explain this? Is it something to do with the introduction of the new cells into the body, that the cells of the organs that are being transplanted retain a memory of the existence of the original owner?
I know a lot of people think that, but I actually believe that that explanation presupposes a totally incoherent view of how memory works. I have an even more exotic explanation.
Okay, let's hear it.
What we say about hauntings is that these are cases which, if genuine, are cases where departed individuals hover around a location that maybe was meaningful to them in their embodied life. So it seems to me that perhaps we can look at these transplant cases as instances where the deceased hover around their still living vital organs. And one of the cases I find particularly suggestive has to do with a young boy, a very young boy, who received a new heart from a tragically deceased another young boy. And, you know, children who haven't yet been polluted by what adults tell them is real or possible may have a truer sense of what's really going on. And the way this young heart recipient described what was going on is that the deceased, named Jerry, was with him. And sometimes he would just give himself over to Jerry and let Jerry take control of the body. So, for example, when the young boy Carter was introduced to Jerry's parents for the first time, he let Jerry take over, as he described it. And Jerry ran to the parents and nuzzled up the way that he used to. So it may be that this child was actually experiencing things more the way they are and not the way we'd like to think they are.
Is it possible that the child was just happy to be alive and understood that these were the parents of the child who made it possible for him to live?
Run that past me one more time.
All right. You said that the child ran to the parents and
Yes.
hugged them because he allowed Jerry to take over his body, I guess.
Yes.
Is it possible that the child in reality was just being thankful for the fact that this mother and father had Jerry, and that thanks to Jerry, even though the loss of Jerry was sad for the family, that because of Jerry's death, this child is alive, and he was thankful?
Well, you might think that, but what the parents found so interesting about it was that Carter, the living young boy, nuzzled up to them in a way that was totally characteristic of what Jerry used to do.
But isn't it also true that when somebody has lost someone, that they start seeing a similarity in a lot of other people, that, Jerry used to do it, or Jerry, you used to do it that way, or look, they're wearing the same kind of clothes that Jerry used to like wearing.
You're absolutely right. It could be a lot of wishful thinking on the parents' part.
Right.
I still find it more interesting that this young boy Carter is the only heart-lung recipient I know of in these cases to have described the phenomena in just this way. And we do know from other investigations that children seem to lose their ESP abilities as the educational system strangles them. And so I'm inclined to give a certain degree of otherwise unexpected credence to what this young boy Carter had to say.
The part that you were saying where the ghost, for a lack of better words, stays with his organs, or the living remains. Now, as I understand it, when somebody dies, their spirit, goes anywhere. I don't know. Their soul. And people who are investigating the paranormal say, well, we never die because matter cannot be destroyed. It can only change form and shape.
Right.
So how do we know that, or why is it possible, how is it possible that this matter that has been freed from the meat suit that we all wear would retain the memories, retain the size, remain contain the stature and the ability to go where these parts are? That I find amazing. And
it is amazing.
Probable.
And we have no idea what the afterlife is like. And different psychics give us sometimes dramatically different stories. The psychic I told you about, Olga Worrell, once said she saw my grandfather standing next to me, my mother's father. I said, "Can you describe him?" And she said, "Well, he's broad." And I said, "Okay." She said, "And he has a beard." I said, "He never used to have a beard." She said, "Well, he does now. He can have a beard if he wants."
All right, stand by, my friend. You and I have to take our final break. Exo Nation, Stephen Braude is our special guest. And if you'd like to find out more about Stephen, his website is jazzphilosopher.com. I'll be back on the other side of this commercial break as we wrap up this hour here in the X Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away. Stephen Braude is my special guest this hour, Exo Nation. His website is jazzphilosopher.com. First of all, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and thank you for all the research and all the investigative work that you've done into the field of parapsychology.
Well, thank you very much.
Let me ask you something, Stephen. Have you've investigated near-death experiences?
Not with the same vigor that I've investigated psychokinetic phenomena. And the reason is that it's very hard to investigate NDEs because you don't really, even if you get very interesting reports from the NDEer about what transpired while they were presumably clinically dead.
Right.
You can't really reliably timestamp when those experiences occurred, whether there was some residual bodily activity or cortical activity going on, or when exactly it was happening. Was it happening when they were just coming out of the most dead part of that clinical death? And they weren't really dead anyway.
Since we cannot depend on the scientific community and other professionals to investigate the paranormal as you have, how would you suggest that we investigate it if we do not use the old tried and true, according to the scientific community, of everything being replicated in a lab?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. See, I think that laboratory research in parapsychology, although I think it has provided us with good evidence that something or other psychic is going on, we can't really learn much from it because we have no idea what kind of real life capacity or ability we're trying to bring into the lab and whether it's even appropriate to bring it into the lab in the first place. I mean, psychic phenomena don't occur just for parapsychologists, and they don't occur only when we set out to look for them. Presumably, our psychic abilities or capacities have some kind of natural history. They have some sort of ordinary stage of operation, and it's those kind of spontaneous psychic experiences that drove researchers into the lab in the first place. So I've often urged that what we really need to do is to find people who really are better at the kind of naturalistic investigation we need to do first to find out what kind of capacity our psychic functioning is and whether it's even appropriate to investigate it under laboratory conditions. There are lots of human capacities that we know are genuine and which can't really be studied profitably in the lab, like wit, or sensuality, or, I mean, this is something that my students used to call the fart factor. I mean, there are all sorts of things we can do in real life, but not just on demand. They're very situation sensitive.
Right.
Most of our capacities are situation sensitive. Even the capacity to produce endorphins, to resist pain, to breathe deeply. So I've often urged that what we really need to do is to start by looking at people who are unusually lucky or unlucky, particularly unlucky people. There's a well-known Yiddish distinction between a schlemiel and a schlemazel. A schlemiel is someone who spills soup on himself, and a schlemazel has it spilled on him. So the idea is that schlemazels are these unlucky souls. They're victims of the universe at large, or impersonal forces. And they really exist. I was actually married to a schlemazel at one point, and she was part of a family of schlemazels. And I even lived next door to a family of schlemazels, this couple. It seemed that they lived in a consumer hell. Everything they bought was defective. Electronic equipment would fail to work right out of the box. A solid wooden rocking chair broke within their first week of ownership with their infant son sitting on it.
Oh my gosh.
Their cars were always in the shop, even though they had brands noted for their reliability. And my favorite example of their schlemazelness, if that's even a word, was the wife bought a large poster-sized photograph of what she thought was the Golden Gate Bridge. She framed it and hung it on her living room wall. And I had to tell her, that's the Brooklyn Bridge.
Oh my gosh.
So here's a woman who both literally and figuratively bought the Brooklyn Bridge.
One of the books you wrote is entitled Immortal Remains, on the evidence for life after death. What's your general position on the topic?
My general position, at least the one I reached by the time I got to the end of the book, was that there is some evidence that I think is very hard to explain away, even if you take fully into account the living agent psi alternative. But it's not a slam dunk case. What we would need for a slam dunk case that would really mean something to the academic and scientific communities would have to be much more dramatic and compelling than what we've been able to get so far. I mean, we've got some really interesting cases, some very great mediums who were able to provide very intimate kinds of details about the deceased over and over for a period of many years, like Mrs. Piper in America. But none of these are slam dunk cases. So while I think there's some reason to believe that we survive bodily death, at least some of us do, and for not eternally, there's no evidence that we live forever. So there's some evidence that some of us seem to survive for at least a limited period of time.
Is reincarnation possible?
I consider that one of the options that we have to consider. Again, there are some very good and intriguing cases. But again, it's not easy to rule out the living agent psi alternative. And one of my disappointments with the literature on reincarnation is that the people involved in the cases are not explained in any psychological, or not described in any psychological depth. So they come off as psychological stick figures, and you can't really evaluate the living agent alternative unless you really dig deep under the surface. And sometimes when you do, you find out reasons for thinking that the living agent alternative is actually a very compelling one. I give a good example of that in my book, Immortal Remains.
In your opinion, is there a connection between the paranormal and other facets of parapsychology and, for example, in the world of alien abductions, UFO sightings, Bigfoot sightings, Loch Ness Monster, and other phenomena? Can we lump it in, or is it associated, affiliated with the parapsychological events that seem to be going on around us at all times?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I thought you were going to ask something else. I mean, what I would say is that one of the reasons I wrote a book on multiple personality was that as I was getting older, or more chronologically challenged, and knowing that I'd have to write a book one of these days on survival, I also knew that a lot of people suffering from multiple personality disorder, or dissociative identity disorder, look a lot like what you see in cases of mediumship. And so I knew I couldn't really do a decent job of evaluating the evidence for postmortem survival until I had a pretty firm grasp of the evidence about multiplicity and the history of hypnosis and dissociation.
Speaking about hypnosis, a lot of people who have experienced what they believe to be an alien abduction base their stories after they have had regressive hypnosis. Is regressive hypnosis credible?
It's not reliable for sure, because it unleashes realms of creativity that we often didn't know we had in us. And people who are that suggestible might be picking up all sorts of subtle cues. And people who seem to be regressed there's some very interesting cases where it looks like they're not really regressed at all. They're just simulating what they think a regressed person would look like. There have been some very careful experiments done with this by Martin Orne from Harvard.
So why do a lot of people believe in hypnosis, past life regression? Once again, is this a sign of the times?
Well, that's been going on for some time. And hypnosis is not a direct route to the truth. Mm-hmm. It's often a direct route to psychic creativity. Do I have time to tell a story?
Yeah, we've got about a minute and a half.
Okay. David Spiegel, a psychiatrist from Stanford, was approached by a TV anchor woman in San Francisco. She said, some of these channels or mediums out here have to be genuine. And Spiegel said, show me anybody who's highly hypnotizable and I'll turn that person into a medium or channel. And so she volunteered her cameraman. And Spiegel made this movie where he hypnotizes this cameraman, and suddenly the guy changes his affect totally. And he starts speaking in this flat voice as if he's an intergalactic communicator. He says something like, greetings, friends. My name is Zantac, and I bring you greetings. And it doesn't show that all mediums are creative constructs, but it shows why that's not an empty issue.
What are your final thoughts for the members of the Exo Nation tonight?
Wow. Be very careful what you believe.
And like I said at the beginning, belief is the strongest power in the universe. If you believe it, it'll happen. Stephen, I want to thank you ever so much for joining us. Continued success, and I would welcome the opportunity at any time to have you back on the show.
Thanks very much. I look forward to that.
You take care of yourself, my friend. Exo Nation, Stephen Braude has been our guest. He is the Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. And his website is jazzphilosopher.com. And the next time Stephen's with us, we'll have to ask him about his connection with jazz. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. This is a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. And we'll be back on the other side of this news break as we continue right here from our broadcast center and studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away.